So yeah, one of the few positive outcomes of COVID-19, if we can say so. Yeah. So we are on time, and so with your permission, shall we start? Like we are also going live on YouTube and recording this meeting. So shall we start?
Sounds good.
All right. So yeah. So ladies and gentlemen, good evening to those who have logged in from India, Singapore, Japan, and Europe. And good morning to those who have joined us from the US. My name is Shivam Srivastav, and I am currently a researcher at Indian Institute of Management, Bangalore. We are delighted to welcome all of you to the panel discussion on the webinar format hosted by the Center for Software and Information Technology Management, CSITMs, which is titled as The Future of Elections, Shaping Research and Election Strategies Through AI and Data Analytics. This panel discussion aims to foster application and dissemination of knowledge for the benefits of academics and professionals from all walks of industry. Our panelists, who are expert in their respective fields, will provide valuable insights and high quality information in the area of management, society, and culture. Before going straight into the discussion, let me give you a brief introduction about the CSITM. So CSITM stands for Center for Software and Information Technology Management, is the IIM Bangalore's Center of Excellence on Digital Technology Management. It fosters close link with the IT sector in India, especially with the Technology Hub. It is also connected globally with management researchers from top universities, practitioners from global tech companies and startup, reputed policymakers of India, and experts intellectual from different part of the world. Now it is my great pleasure and privilege, and we are really honored today to introduce the esteemed panelists who have joined us for this exciting session. Our first panelist is Dr. Christopher Velizian. Dr. Chris is a Hogg Professor of Government at the Department of Government at the University of Texas at Austin. He holds or has held positions, both permanent and visiting, at various universities in the United States and the other countries. His primary ongoing research develops and tests a thermostatic model of public opinion and policy. His current research, on which considers news coverage and how it mediates public responsiveness to policy. His other major project assesses the evolution of voter preferences over the course of the election timeline. His recent research, on which considers variation in pre-election polls errors in more than 300 elections in over 40 countries since polling began 80 years ago. He has published numerous journal articles as well as a number of books, including Degree of Democracy, The Timeline of Elections, Who Gets Represented, and most recently, Information and Democracy, Public Policy in the News. Our second panelist is Dr. Ananya Singh. Dr. Ananya Singh is the Alfred Blumstein Career Development Associate Professor at the Carnegie Mellon University's Heinz College. Before joining Carnegie Mellon, Dr. Singh was the postdoctoral associate at the Sloan School of Management, Massachusetts Institute of Technology. He earned his PhD from the Toulouse School of Economics. Dr. Singh's research focuses on the intersection of technology and society, with a particular focus on platforms and digitization. His work is empirical, employing a varieties of methods such as field experiment, natural experiments within observational data, and online survey experiments. He is particularly interested in analyzing the impact of digital technologies on firms, with a special focus on media markets and society. His research also delves into the strategies adopted by platform and user in response to digital disruption over the past 2 decades. His research has been accepted or published in leading journals, including Management Science, Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, and the Journal of Marketing Research. Our third panelist is Dr. Connor T. Jerzak. He is an assistant professor in the Department of Government at the University of Texas at Austin. He earned his master's in statistics and PhD in government from Harvard University. During his graduate studies, he interned at Adobe Research in San Jose, California. During 2021-2022, Dr. Jerzak completed a postdoctoral fellowship in Linköping University in Sweden and served as a visiting scholar at the University of Gothenburg. Dr. Jerzak's research spans machine learning, economics, and political science, has been published in various peer-reviewed venues. In 2024, he taught at the Harvard University. Our fourth panelist is Dr. Kokil Jetka. Dr. Kokil Jetka is an assistant professor in the computational communication at the National University of Singapore, which is NUS. Her research focuses on public opinion analytics, examining the impact of shadow banning on online discourse and enhancing the quality of political discussions. She is dedicated to advancing the understanding of political communication through computational methods, aiming to foster more informed and constructive online conversation. Before joining NUS, Dr. Kokil served as a presidential postdoctoral fellow at the NTU, Nanyang Technological University. She also spent 2 years as the postdoctoral researcher at the University of Pennsylvania, contributing to the World Wellbeing Project. Prior to her academic career, she worked as a data scientist at Adobe Bangalore. So I would like to welcome all of you, including panelists and the attendees, to this forum. And I would like to set the structure for today's discussion. Each panelist would present his or her perspective for about 12 minutes. This would be followed by a discussion. The panel have agreed to take questions from the audience at the end. So do type in your questions as and when they occur to you. The sequence of today's presentation would be Professor Chris, Professor Ananya, Professor Connor, and Professor Kokil. So without any further ado, it is my great pleasure to invite Dr. Chris to share his invaluable insights and expertise with us. Over to you, Dr. Chris.
Thank you, Shivam, for that. Can you see my screen?
Yeah.
Great. Okay. Thank you, Shivam. Thank you especially for including me. Hi to attendees, and thanks for coming. I'm going to try to provide some broad architecture of election campaigns focusing on the past with hopefully some implications for the future. Specifically, I'll be focusing on the alignment between polls and the vote. I mean, it's pretty clear from my title, over the campaign timeline. And I'll be doing this across elections, across parties, and across countries, using a whole lot of data, beginning in 1940 and extending just about up to the modern day. We're updating the time series at the moment. My talk builds on work with Bob Erickson from Columbia University, especially early on, 20, 25 years ago, 15 years ago. And more recently, Will Jennings of Southampton University. The comparative research on which I'll be focusing today is mostly with Will. So thanks, Bob. Thanks, Will. And here we go. The timeline of elections. It's pretty basic. Just consider the timeline of an election as beginning at some point, right? And we can think about it the day after the last election. And we could end that timeline on election day itself. And we could imagine having over this timeline polls regularly would be good. Daily would be very good. And we can think about them as being, for the purposes of sort of theorizing that these are perfect polls. I know that doesn't make sense. But we're interested in whether or not preferences are in place early, or they come into a focus late. And what we're really interested in here is the answer to two questions. Do preferences change? And two, do the changes that we do observe last? And that's what I'm going to be spending some time on. There's a lot of technical stuff that I'm going to overlook in the main talk, but I'm happy to visit in Q&A. Bumps and bounces, right? So if there's you can think of this as three hypothetical campaign effects. You have on the left, in the left frame, a bounce, which is a short-lived effect. So we see a jump up, and then over time, right, which is the x-axis here, the shock decays, and here in a very sort of predictable autoregressive way. There's a bump, which is different from a bounce. And these are just words we use to kind of help people conceive and think as we proceed. A bump is just an effect that happens and lasts. And the third possibility is a hybrid effect, where here there's a number of ways this can happen. Is you could have some effects last, some effects decay, some parts of effects last, some parts decay. Some people are accumulators, right? Where shocks impact them and last, and others are not. And so, and when we're dealing with aggregates, we're sort of encompassing all three of those. The classic approach to trying to detect these kinds of effects is this time series approach. This is an autoregressive model where we have a poll on a day t, regressed, right, or modeled as a function of a poll on the previous day and an error term, which is important, that error term, right? We could think about this. This is just a single time series, but we could think about it as across many different elections, across countries, across parties. And we're really interested in the B, but because it tells us how much of a poll margin lasts, right, from one day to the next. If it's one, then affects, there's bumps, right? If it's less than one, there are bounces, right? And the size of the B is important here as well. How long does the bounce last? But we're also interested in the shocks, right, which is the variance of E sub t, because that gives us the campaign effects themselves, right, which then we're mapping through polls at one point in time to the next or not. Okay, so that's a classic approach. There's a problem with this kind of approach when we're dealing with most election cycles in most countries, is we have really slim, lots of missing data. We don't have independent readings, right? That there's overlapping respondents, there's overlapping polling periods, which means that the readings are not right. They're not truly independent. Even where we do have the readings, right? We have survey error, and other short-term sort of effects, right? That complicate analyses of persistence. So what can we do? So what we proposed a long time ago is looking at cross sections. We could assess the relationship, how polls converge on the votes across elections on different days. And so that's really what we have referred to as the timeline approach. It's kind of a neat approach too, because it gives us the sense for when polls are actually converging on the result, right? So it's not just a statistical phenomenon. It gives us do polls 10 days out match up the vote? How about 100 days out, and to what degree? This is the different equation. And here we're regressing the votes, not the polls on the polls, right? Lag polls, we're taking vote on the polls, again, across parties, elections, countries, on each day. So we can think of the vote in 15 elections in a country on day, the vote in 15 elections regressed on the polls a day before, the polls 2 days before, the polls 3 days before, and so on. And we could use all kinds of different kinds of imputation methods to deal with the missing data, which turns out it doesn't really make much difference. Again, now here the regression coefficient is important here because it tells us how much of the current poll margin survives to election day. But we're also interested in the fit, right? And we could think about, we originally started and we focused on the United States, on the R squared. When we moved into a comparative context, it became necessary to use something that was more generalizable. The root mean squared error is something that gives us a sense for the predictability, right, of basically the alignments, right, between the polls and the vote. And the idea is as B approaches 1 and the root mean squared error goes to 0, the polls become fully predictive and reflective. They match, they literally match, congruence, right, between the two. Okay, so that was, that's kind of a nice approach, but it's not sufficiently general. And we started thinking about a way to think about how could we conceive of a statistic that would capture that those two statistics. And we started focusing on the mean absolute error, which led us then to morph into an analysis that allows us to take into account country level differences, party level differences, and also election level differences, right? And that's outlined in this equation here, where we focus on the absolute error in the polls. And again, it's the vote at the end of the election cycle and the polls on any particular day regressed on a bunch of independent variables, both additively, right, and interactively with time, which allows us then to assess the different kinds of structural effects and temporally dependent effects that variables could have. And so it's really, really nice because we have a whole ton of data, and that's important because we have a whole ton of variables that we want to assess, and we want to assess these different kinds of effects. So what kinds of effects do we want to assess? Here's just some of the things. I mean, I really I don't have time to go into great depth, but we could think of government institutions as mattering, presidential elections versus legislative. We expect the latter preferences to be more party-based and come into a focus earlier. They do turn out to be that way, although that's not much of the focus of today. Electoral rules, proportional systems are different from single-member districts. We expect different kinds of structuration there. But there's party-level effects too, and these turn out to be really, really important because they could mediate institutional effects, and it turns out they do. Party size, party incumbency, party age, party scope, and other variables. And elections themselves, although we're not going to get into that today, there's just too many moving parts for that. Here's different kinds of effects. You can have a level effect, right? An additive effect. You could have an interactive effect. You could have in a level effect in frame I, an interactive effect in frame 2, and then a combination of the two in frame 3. And time here effects. I'm characterizing in a linear way. They're nonlinear, and as you'll see, and we allow for that in a very flexible specification. So data, national trial heat polls, day by day, wherever you have them. It turns out, and this asks who would you vote for if the election were held today. We're looking at party support in legislative elections, 358 election cycles, 44 countries between 1942 and 2017. There's 34,000 polls almost. There's a lot of polls here. If you like data, this is for you. All this stuff's been archived, by the way. So if you want our data and code, help yourself. Harvard Dataverse, Connor, right down the street from you. Okay, so what are we doing here? Here's the countries. I'm sorry, we don't have India in here. It's a data issue. It's nothing, it's not an arbitrary thing. And if you have data for us, please send it along. We will include it and we'll acknowledge you and we'll cite anything that you want us to cite. So please don't be shy. Okay, just to give you a sense for the relationship between the vote and the polls over time. On the upper left-hand corner is 900 days out. And in the lower right-hand corner is 1 day out. And you could see there's alignment early on. That's not surprising because you have big parties and small parties, and they're being reflected in that figure. But things start to really, really tighten up right toward the end. But you can see it even by 200 days out. Just to give you a sense for what's going on here. This is for all legislative elections. Here's for the last 200 days, the mean absolute error. And just keep in mind, a lot of people forget this. I know you all know that, but even at the end, there's error. It's unavoidable. So we don't expect the polls to be perfect, right? And they're not, right? Here's the difference between presidential and parliamentary elections, just to give you a little bit of a sense for things. But okay, so, and I know I've got about a minute or so, and I just want to walk you through a little bit here. What we're again, the regression is the absolute error on these system level variables, these party level variables, both additively and interactively with time. We specifically, the absolute error is actually log normal distribution. So we take the natural log of the error plus one, and we have a nonlinear temporal variable. And just to give you a sense for what's going on here, here's the kinds of plots we get. And I'm not going to walk you through this kind of thing, but you basically see institutional effects, pretty darn reliable. This is based on multiple imputation. Um, pretty highly reliable effects. Some institutional effects, a lot of party effects. Most of the institutional effects are mediated, as it turns out. And which is really one of the benefits of this kind of analysis that allows you to put them all these factors in together in a competition. So what's the bottom line? Polls become increasingly informative about the vote over the election cycle. The errors decline. This happens, really speeds up late, but it's already happening early. System characteristics matter. Party characteristics matter. Party size is a really big factor. And there's a number of explanations for this, none of which tell a clear story here. And most importantly, I think a general takeaway, when we're looking at the performance of polls, the evolution of, at the end, the evolution of polls over the course of election campaigns, we have to bear in mind institutional context. Not all countries are the same. And even within countries, we have to bear in mind the differences across parties. They're not all the same, and it matters in a pretty powerful way for what we actually observe. There's some published research. I want to thank you. And I look forward to questions, comments.
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Chris, for explaining the details of how polling accuracy varies in different electoral systems and party sizes. Your views into how institutional and party traits affect polling results have helped us to understand what influences election predictions. So, yeah, we really appreciate your inputs in today's our discussion. Now, I would like to request Dr. Ananya Sen to share his thoughts. Over to you, Dr. Sen.
Thank you. Let me share my. One sec. Oh, looks good. You can hear me? Okay.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great. So again, thank you, Shivam, for having us all here, and thank you for everyone who's joined the webinar. It's great to follow Chris's presentation, and I'm going to take a slightly different approach, which is that Chris went into spoke about one paper. I'm going to give you an overview of two papers in the next 10 to 12 minutes. And it's going to be informed, by my broad research agenda, focused on, questions at the intersection of technology, business, and society, with a focus on platforms and digitization. And the focus will be on thinking through platforms and technology in the context of politics broadly defined. The questions that I'm interested in broadly are about the potentials and pitfalls of new technologies for different players within the platform ecosystem. And so, as the title of the webinar is about the role of analytics, the role of AI in elections, I'm going to first talk about the potential of social media platforms for politicians. And here I'm going to try and put forward or make a case for the role of simple analytics for research for politicians potentially. And the second project that I'm going to talk about is going to focus on artificial intelligence, or the rise of generative AI, because of course we need to tackle that head on as well. So for the first part, when we talk about the role of analytics, I'm going to talk about social media platforms, and it's going to be based on my research with Maria Petrova and Pinar Yildirim, in particular talking about the use of Twitter and how that might impact political contributions. Um, the motivation for this, sorry, Shivam, you have a question?
No, sorry.
Okay, got it. No problem. Um, So the motivation for this project was basically that electoral competition is supposed to promote good governance. There's a lot of there's a lot of evidence for that, but often electoral competition is limited by the lack of new and able candidates. There are barriers to entry. They might be financial to set up a party, to set up a campaign. They might be informational. You want to do it, you have the resources. How do you get the word out? There are big incumbency advantages, especially in the US. So the idea behind these social media platforms when they first came in about 20 years ago was that maybe they provide a relatively cheap method through which candidates can raise money and advertise their policy platforms. You might think of this paper now as a historical study. Obviously, with Chris's presentation, it was over the past 80 years. We look at 2008 to 2014 and try to understand how Twitter adoption might have helped U.S. Congress candidates raise political donations. And we use difference in difference set up to try and identify these issues. I encourage you to take a look at the paper, but I'm going to give you the high level here. Basically, we look at the precise timing of the adoption of Twitter by different candidates and compare their political donations that they get before and after the use of Twitter, and across areas in the US where there was high Twitter usage relative to low Twitter usage. Okay. And that's how we try and pin down the causal effect. What do we find? We find that Twitter helps politicians to raise to raise donations after they join Twitter. But this effect is basically driven by new politicians, not experienced ones. So politicians who've never contested an election before are the ones that increase their donations by up to 5%. And we demonstrate that increased information is a likely channel because it gets new donors into the fold. The effect is stronger for places where there's lower newspaper circulation. So social media might be playing, might be providing them an alternative platform, and the effect is strongest for donations which are small. The picture on the left basically is one of our main results, which is that politicians who after they join Twitter in high penetration areas see a larger bump relative to those in lower penetration areas. One of the implications is that social media might reduce barriers to entry into politics. So that's the high level. But in terms of taking this forward, as I said, this is we started working on this a decade ago. It got published a few years ago. Standard publishing timelines. But going forward, social media platforms have been around for a while. Should we, what can we do to further our sort of understanding? And here I would make the case that, the landscape is still evolving, and we have a limited understanding of how one should use social media and its impact on voters, even though politicians, political parties across the world are using social media right now. For example, in India, in the most recent elections, a variety of social media platforms are used. But when you think about the rise of new political parties and relatively unknown politicians, such as the Aam Aadmi Party led by Arvind Kejriwal in India, or the rise of Bernie Sanders, in 2015, 2016, it was their ability to potentially circumvent the narrative in mainstream media and build that grassroots support. So how can we use simple analytics to understand questions around this? I'm a big proponent of using A/B testing as much as possible, and I know that political parties do that. I think researchers need to do that. We need to understand which platforms work better and in what context. The study that I presented was about Twitter, but now the younger folks are flocking to TikTok. Uh, TikTok might get banned in the US. TikTok is banned in India, but WhatsApp plays a big role in India. So can we identify what messages work and when? And for this, you don't necessarily need fancy generative AI or AI in general. These are just standard analytics, which can still further our understanding of these questions. So that's the first part of this talk where I highlight just standard social media platforms and the potential that they might have down the road. In the next few minutes, I want to talk about a related topic, again, in the political space, of course, but focusing on the potential pitfalls of new automation technologies, in particular AI and AI, generative AI. And this is in the context of misinformation. This part of the talk is based on a paper I co-authored with Vajiha Ahmed, Chuck Easley, and Eric Brynjolfsson, which recently, a couple of months ago, came out in Nature. And the big picture was the following. We wanted to tackle the problem of misinformation. Just for everyone here, misinformation is incorrect or misleading information presented as fact. Often when we think of tackling misinformation, we focus on the user, right? That we give you certain prompts to read before sharing, to fact check, etc. But in this case, we try to study whether we can limit the funding of these misinformation websites themselves. So propose a supply side approach in tackling misinformation. An example that we looked at was, this is a misinformation website which is basically funded by ads. Example by the Coca-Cola company here. The ad is served by infolinks, and there is anti-vax disinformation, and these websites play a crucial role in spreading misinformation. So the questions that we ask is, what's the role of advertisers and platforms in monetizing misinformation? Do consumers care about this? And what are the beliefs and preferences of companies that might care about limiting the financing of misinformation? I'm going to be pretty quick over this because I know that I have a couple of minutes left. What we find is that misinformation is primarily sustained through advertising, but when companies use digital ad platforms, so think of the automated placement of ads on these websites through the Google ad network, DoubleClick, Microsoft's App Nexus. These ads are 10 times more likely to appear on misinformation websites, and it's spread across different industries. Do consumers care about the advertising on misinformation websites? We run a survey experiment to find that if we tell consumers that the company that you like has been advertising on misinformation websites, then they want to switch away from it. Do decision makers know that they're advertising on these misinformation websites? We find that 80% of them believe that their company's ads don't appear on misinformation websites, despite 80% of those in our data set actually appearing on misinformation websites. So they are misinformed about their own advertising strategies. So to sort of round up, this problem is probably going to get exacerbated with the rise of generative AI, which reduces the cost of setting up such misinformation websites. And automation of ad placements makes it harder to limit the funding of such misinformation websites. And again, this is not only a US issue, this is this is also happening in India, where there's automated ad placement through the Google Ad Network, for example. That's all I have, and I yield back.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Sain, for your insightful presentation on the role of digital platforms in politics and analytics. Several highlights, such as how social media like Twitter can reduce barriers for new political candidates, and the financial dynamic which you have just explained, online misinformation, emphasizing the needs for the greater transparency and accountability in digital advertising. We will delve deeper into your presentation during the Q&A session. It's time for Dr. Connor to share his presentation with us. Over to you, Dr. Connor.
Here we go. Thank you, Shivam. Thank you to the attendees, other panelists. Great to be here today. So the project that I'll be talking about over the next 10 or so minutes, it's more of a methodological project. I'll talk about a method that we've been working on that we can use to analyze an existing form of data to try to learn more about election strategies. So this is joint work with Kosuke Amai and the title, selecting optimal candidate profiles in adversarial environments using conjoint analysis. So just to set the stage, I'll try to give a little bit of motivation for what we're trying to do here using some survey data on the 2016 U.S. election, Trump versus Clinton. So these political candidates, they don't just have one attribute. Trump, Clinton, there are a lot of different aspects that these candidates embody, and voters have different views on each of those aspects, like which of the two, Trump versus Clinton, would be better, for example, at dealing with the economy, which would be better at appointing Supreme Court justices, and so on and so forth. So there are all these different issues and all these different attributes that each candidate has. And even within something specific like tax policy, the two are further differentiated. So if we look at Clinton and Trump's policy agendas regarding taxation, look at all the different features, look at all the different attributes regarding, itemization regarding each of these different aspects of the tax code. So the big picture point here is that these candidates that we're trying to analyze when forming electoral strategies, they're not unidimensional, but they're in some sense multidimensional. They have these different attributes, these different policy item points, and the question is, how can we learn more about them in some principled way using observable data from, for example, conjoint experiments. So just to give you motivation for that, the big picture question that we're trying to ask here is what makes a candidate more preferable in the context of multidimensional preferences, but also in the context of competition, and then finally in the context of institutional constraints. So the electoral system isn't just, at least in the US context, we don't just have, the general election. We have also a primary election, which will, in a sense, condition the results that we'll see in the general election. And similar sorts of things happen in other places as well. So this is the big picture question that we'll try to analyze together in the next 8 or so minutes. And the starting point for this will be a specific kind of research design that will be the seed of the ideas that we'll talk later on about. So one research design that scholars, investigators, campaigns can use to try to understand this is to basically employ a forced choice conjoint experimental design in a survey context. So the idea here is very simple. In a survey, respondents are asked a question like the following: which of the candidates would you prefer? And then they're shown candidate profiles like so. They're shown two candidates, one of which, has these different attributes: male Republican, will cut taxes, Hispanic, compassionate, and the other which has these other attributes: male Democrat, cut taxes, Black, provide strong leadership. These are the different attributes of the two candidates, and each of these features have been randomized to the two, and the respondents are asked which one of the two would be preferred. So it's a simple but very powerful design at trying to get at these multidimensional preferences in a way that we'll talk a bit more about as we go. So if we think about this, we have this randomization of features. Each of these are being independently randomized, and this generates high dimensional treatment space. And the question that we'll be asking is, how do we process that high-dimensional treatment space? So I'm going to talk a little bit about kind of prior work on this, a little bit about what we've done, and then a flavor of the results that we can get from this. And then I think that'll be all the time that we have for. So in terms of existing methods, what are the existing ways that people have used when analyzing that data type that I talked about a moment ago? One of the big methods people have used to analyze that is something called the average marginal component effect. So this language might be new to you, but the intuition is very simple. The intuition is basically we compare the effect of one factor against another, averaging over all the other features. So the idea here is we take all of the candidates who've been randomized to be female and all of the candidate profiles that have been randomized to be male, and we look overall on average which of the two is preferred by voters, averaging over all the other features. So this is one of the existing tools that have been used here. And there's also been a lot of work on exploring what's termed heterogeneous effects. So that's the idea that different sorts of voters will respond to different sorts of features in their candidates. So there are different modeling strategies here to kind of probe that heterogeneity in the context of conjoint experiments. So just a few observations here. These existing methods, they primarily focus on one or two factors at a time. They're not looking at everything, at all the different attributes, but they're looking at one or two at a time. So in a sense, we're collapsing across the multidimensionality that we have in the data. Another thing is that the strategic considerations aren't explicitly being quantified. When we're thinking about strategy, we have to remember that institutions will structure how that competition unfolds. So something like the average marginal component effect, it's not directly taking into account the structure, for example, of the primary system that conditions the general election results. So are there ways we can bring those strategic institutional considerations into the fold here? And that'll be one of the big motivations for what I'll talk about in the next few minutes. So what we're trying to do in this project is we're going to not focus just on one or two factors at a time, but we're going to try to summarize the role of all of the factors at once. And we're going to do that summarization in some optimal way. So that's kind of the first big kind of bucket or contribution that we're trying to make here in this project. And then the second contribution that we're trying to make is we're trying to explicitly bring those strategic considerations into the fold. So we're going to develop a way of explicitly incorporating those strategic dynamics and also institutional constraints, in propagating uncertainties too. Since if I'm a campaign manager, if I'm trying to, devise optimal strategies, it's not enough just to get a directional signal, but we also will want to know how noisy is that signal. Is it very precise or is it very noisy? Is it very uncertain? So we'll also think very carefully about that as well. And in general, we'll try to usefully characterize these strategic dynamics in conjoint data with the methods that we'll try to build on here. And I should mention the methods that we'll develop here critically depend on AI infrastructure. So infrastructure that was developed for AI work, for example, linear algebra compilers, gradient descent. These are things that will come into the fold here as well when we're analyzing the data just described. So, with just 10 or 12 minutes, we don't have time to go through all the results. We can talk obviously in the Q&A, and I can send the paper along as well. But just to give you a flavor for what we're up to here, I'll talk about two results and then a data analysis using the method here. The first result is basically deriving a closed form formula for the best strategy, which holds fixed my opponent's strategy. So we have those two candidates, candidate A and candidate B. And in this first set of results, we have basically a formula, a mathematical formula that tells you, given the preferences that we analyzed from the conjoint data, what's my best strategy? And the computational complexity here is written out in a particular way. And the big picture point here is that this is a very efficient, computationally efficient, but in some sense, unrealistic way of analyzing data, because we're just looking at the best strategy for me, not taking into account my opponent in their optimization. So what we then do in the paper is we go through this adversarial case setup, and we analyze in that setting the best strategy of me when my opponent is also optimizing their strategy under institutional constraints. So the intuition here is that if I'm a let's say Democratic Party leader, I'm trying to choose the best set of candidates for my side, while also understanding the fact that the other side is going to be choosing their best candidates to try to counter the candidates that I'm going to be choosing. So in a sense, it's connecting experimental design experimental analysis, conjoint analysis with a certain game theoretic notion as well. So this is a more realistic setup, but it's also going to there's no, and it's all AI and some of these computational infrastructures developed for building things like neural networks. So things like auto differentiation, gradient descent, XLA compilers, just to name a few that I mentioned before as well. These are going to be used here just to perform estimation. So giving you just a bit of flavor for the results that we get here, just in the remaining 2 minutes, we're going to reanalyze data from this conjoint experiment on the effect of candidate sex on voter choice. So this was a forced choice conjoint design, the same exact design that I talked about at the beginning. And respondents were, so they basically saw these two candidate profiles with all of the candidate features randomized. The features randomized were things like gender, policy positions, race, experience, party, and so forth. And the original paper focused mostly on gender, like the marginal effect of gender. But we don't want to just look at the marginal effect of just that one thing. We want to look at the optimal strategy across all of the different features, not just that one feature. And we're also going to compare and contrast the average case versus the adversarial case results. And this is going to be something we do as well. And we're going to compare that to historical, in the paper at least, historical experience. So this is the setup. And just to give you some flavor of the results, I'm going to show you the results in the average case. And then I'm going to show you the results in the adversarial case. And we see that the adversarial case results are more congruent with real behavior that parties use. So just this is the sort of output we get. And I'm just looking at two of the factors right now, but in the paper, we look at all the factors together. This is just a snapshot. So each point here, basically, each point, black indicates like the optimal strategy across all voters, blue across Democratic voters, red across Republican voters, green across independent voters. And whether something's more to the left or more to the right indicates whether in that optimal strategy, it's better for that group to upweigh these candidate features or those other candidate features. So this is giving us a sense of what features are better to upweigh or downweigh from a purely strategic point of view. And just to give you a sense, we have this red here. So in the average case analysis, the optimal strategy should upweigh basically black female candidates on the Republican side. But looking at historical experience among Republican candidates, we just don't see that sort of candidate coming up. So the question is why? So we rerun the same exact analysis, but now integrating in that notion of competition, integrating in that notion of my opponents are going to try to optimize against me too. And when we do that, we see results that are more in line with kind of historical experience where the Republican strategy in this sense upweighs white male candidates. And also we have results about kind of quantifying this notion of similarity to historical experience a bit more formally. So this is just giving you a very brief flavor, a very small snapshot here. And, they're going to be next steps. They're going to be takeaways. And the takeaways here is that the social world, the political world is competitive and it's high-dimensional, but the statistical summaries, the analytics that we choose are often unidimensional. And sometimes that's great, but in other times we might want a more holistic perspective. So the regime that we're trying to build up here is going to give us a gateway to that more holistic interpretation, and it's going to allow us to incorporate in competitive dynamics, while also depending on that AI infrastructure that we've been talking a little bit about. So I'm just going to pause there. I think I'm at time, but thank you for your attention and looking forward to the discussion.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Connor, for your presentation and choosing the best candidate profiles. Your presentation helps us to understand what makes a candidate more appealing, more preferable by considering various factors, as you mentioned, and competition. It also shows how strategies and rules can affect their choices, offering new ways to analyze elections. So thank you so much and really appreciate your time and insights. Over to you, Dr. Kokil.
Hello, you can see my screen?
Yeah, we can share.
Awesome. Okay, hello everyone, and thank you for being here. Thank you again, Shivam, for organizing this and putting us all together. My name is Kokil Jedka, and thank you very much for the kind introduction as well. I'm in Singapore, and my talk is going to be a little bit different. I wanted to focus a lot more on the future of elections, given that we are dealing with a crazy deluge of misinformation, especially that the voters are facing, and what AI is contributing to the problem, as well as what AI could do to hopefully salvage it. So my talk is titled Understanding AI-Generated Misinformation, Challenges and Implications, Navigating the Impact of AI on Information Integrity. I'm going to be talking about my work collected from a few papers. So apologies, it will be more high level than the other studies, but I'd be happy to, other talks, but I'd be happy to go into more details in the Q&A. So I work with social media data, which means it's not as clean. It doesn't allow for some great experiments. In fact, the experiments we do tend to be really problematic and messy and have small effect sizes. What you see on the screen is something I edited out of XKCD, which is pretty much the problem with looking at political posts in social media. The actual topic of social media posts tagged politics by year. You'll see it's only the purple part that's actually about politics, and everything, it's mostly about everything else. Of course, this is not to scale, but it pretty much sets up the kind of problem that we're dealing with in terms of understanding public opinion through social media. In the South Asian context, with its diverse population and rapid digital growth, it's of course particularly vulnerable to AI-generated misinformation, also because of the linguistic diversity and high social media usage, which creates fertile ground for the rapid spread of AI-generated false narratives. Another issue we see is that companies often wash their hands off of low-resource languages that are prevalent across Asia. Low resource but high population. Ironic how that works. So what you see on the screen is where false information is posing the biggest threat. India is number one, not something to be very proud of here, but you see that the darker colors are pretty concentrated in the Southeast Asian and South Asian context. And this is data from the World Economic Forum based on 1490 expert opinions. You see on the right some examples of the kinds of misinformation, and I'm going to refer to this later as well. On top, you see what's known as, or what we call in the business, out of context misinformation, which is that they took the image from something else. They took an image from the 2014 photo and they posted it together with something else to create a fake narrative about what was going on. And these are some of the studies, some of the types of misinformation that have been circulating like crazy on WhatsApp. Around 80% first-time voters encountered fake news on social media, according to a survey conducted earlier in Jan and reported by the Times of India. So the problem is rife, and the typical themes of misinformation are around political campaigns, religious tensions, and health misinformation. And if you do want to know more about the state of misinformation, especially in the Indian context and in the WhatsApp context, I'd strongly recommend the work of my colleague, Kiran Karimela. He has a Nature comment also out recently. And here's an example of the kind of misinformation that my dad loves to share on WhatsApp. Okay, so how is this misinformation created? Multimodal models are slightly different than what you see on your screen, but for the sake of simplicity, right now I'm going to talk about large language models. What these models basically do is they train on hundreds of books or much of the internet, absorb vast amounts of information, and then they leverage a mix of representation. So they learn to represent the data that they've ingested in various ways. They learn to represent it so that given a particular kind of question, they pick out the best representation, and then they generate something that is statistically supposed to be the best or most appropriate answer. So that's the math or the idea behind it. On the front, we see something that looks super polished. If you were interested in reading more about how ChatGPT and other LLMs work, this was a great primer. On the right, you see that things are getting fancy and hard to distinguish between the reality and a fake. This looks pretty realistic, but no, the Pope does not have a fancy jacket like that we know of. Large language models are dangerous, so they're great. They're the cutting edge and so on, but they're also dangerous. And you see here an article from Harvard Misinformation Review. Honestly, this article was trying to cut down the impact or the potential harms of AI-generated misinformation or generative AI on misinformation. But while I disagree with them, I think the taxonomy they provide and the arguments they provide are great to set up what I want to talk about, which is what large language models make possible, as Ananya has also pointed out, is that there's an increased quantity of misinformation. But also what I want to talk about is increased quality and increased personalization. And what that ends up doing is creating a situation where it sounds so good that it sounds extremely believable. Another kind of problem that's happening is the bias, and this word gets thrown about a lot, but let me try and break it down for you. And the way to read this slide is from the left. So for instance, a bias in AI-generated misinformation is like if you ask it, for instance, to write an essay on a topic, what it will do is try to give you an essay, even if the essay makes no sense, even if it's on a misinformation topic, such as cancer and suicide, something that we prompt it with, because it has a truth default bias. It assumes that whatever the user is saying is true. A different kind of bias you see on the right is an affective bias, where you'll see that the color, I'm sorry, this is so hard to read, but the color indicates that attitudes towards people in a certain part of the world are more negative than others. And this is preliminary work we did to try to understand what the bias was with older models. Newer models still have this problem, but the figures may look a bit different. In terms of the truth default that I was talking about, you ask GPT a question and it will give you an answer that seems to make sense. On the left is something that a lot of us in India have seen circulated on WhatsApp a lot, which again, LLMs, our ChatGPT was happy to endorse, at least this version was. And when you try to fact check it, as you see in the right, it will correct itself. But that's not feasible, right? That's not something we want. And what this means is that without intending to, users could generate plausible looking information that is entirely inaccurate, which could potentially spread, because we're often creating or asking these questions to share them with others. For instance, my dad telling me that in fact, Jan Gan Man is the best national anthem in the whole world. So there are many problems with this, but hopefully these are problems that we can resolve. And before I get into that, I want to talk about something else that's on the horizon for us. It's search with ChatGPT. A lot of us are already doing it. It's easy to get an answer as long as it doesn't require fact checking. So search engines are designed to respond to users' queries by pulling together information from different sources. And of course, something like ChatGPT is great to do that. But asking computers a question and getting an answer in natural language can hide the complexity behind synthesizing those sources. It looks like the answer is very authoritative, but that authority is not deserved. We are assuming that the machine understands what we are saying, to be very specific. So there are problems around what people consume, and there are problems around the accuracy of it. And there are also problems around the persuasiveness of these technologies, because in a recent study that's under review by my colleagues, they found that persuasive and customized chatbots were more persuasive than humans in convincing people on some topics. And I'd encourage you to have a look at this paper. It's under review or revision at a major journal. But now I want to talk about, in the last few minutes I have left, I want to talk about what AI can do to fix the problems it's created. Can it level the playing field? Generative AI has the potential to disrupt existing power dynamics, as my colleague said. And by democratizing content creation, it challenges the dominance of well-resourced political parties. And that's something even Ananya was pointing out, that it is something that could happen. So at this point, I want to talk about a few of the projects that we've been working on our side to try to use LLMs for benefit, use LLMs to create more persuasive and evidence-focused or unbiased arguments. So you saw the example of how prompting a chatbot to be more precise could help it do better. And this is something that we've worked on recently. We have one abstract published at AAAI and another one under review. And what we did was we devised a system. We evaluated a bunch of prompt-based approaches to get chatbots, not just ChatGPT, but others as well, to be more precise, basically by asking it to think through what it just said. Sounds simple, but we wanted an approach that would work in a black box, so that an end user would not have to know what's going on behind the hood, but still could rely on what was coming out. So what you see here is the original prompt. And what the chatbot would want to do is generate something that's at least, at the very least, misogynistic. But by asking the chatbot what is the underlying implication and asking it to revise that based on possible biases, it manages to generate, on average and very significantly, better than other methods, an unbiased output. And this is not just true for gender, but we looked at a bunch of social biases that are covered. So that's great. We can have unbiased text. Can we have can we have it more grounded in evidence? So this is the other study that we're working on right now, where what you see is we are trying to get an evidence retrieval system to provide some more facts or more specific facts to chatbots so that they can generate counter arguments to persuade people which are grounded in real information. In that way, we are sort of controlling the information space that it should work with, but we're ensuring the credibility as much as we can. A third approach is plugins for fact checking. So now the problem with fact checking is that it's really hard to scale up. It's very hard to train people to be fact checkers, and honestly, nobody cares. So there are plugins available in, if you'd like to add such plugins to your browser and improve your browsing experience. What we're trying to do at our end is my colleagues at NUS have worked on this chatbot, which works on out of context misinformation, which I showed you earlier, identifies when something is out of context and provides the correct context. So we're incorporating that into a chatbot, which is which we did find in their preliminary studies. They find that people that it is helpful to correct people's misinformation. We're doing more lengthy evaluations now with a full-fledged chatbot. And in training fact checkers, we're also trying to provide more strategies for them to broaden the ways they could consider fact checking, where the idea here is to shorten the time it takes to fact check a new claim based on information that the chatbot can help pull out. So to wrap up, as I'm out of time, what's next? We are developing and curating databases of region-focused fake news examples focusing on South Asia, because even though we have so much misinformation, we need more data sets about it. We're doing field experiments to test interventions. So we are designing and conducting survey experiments to evaluate the effectiveness of various interventions, and resources for fact checkers and platforms, what I showed you at the very end, which is to create something that can train fact checkers to do a better job. And that's also something we're working on, and it's under review. So thank you so much for your time. That was my brief presentation, telling you about the role of LLMs, first in creating a problem and then hopefully solving it. And I look forward to your questions.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Kokil, for your impactful presentation on tackling misinformation, particularly focusing in South Asian languages. In a very short span, you highlighted the importance of curating region-specific AI-generated fake news and supporting fact checkers, especially in underrepresented or low-resource languages. We greatly appreciate your insights. And if I may ask, Professor Kokil, to you, that since your research focuses on AI, misinformation, and political discourse particularly, which provides key insights into how digital tools shape the public sphere, do you see these technologies mitigating or exacerbating the polarization of political dialogue as AI increasingly influence online discourse, and particularly in identifying and curating region-specific misinformation? And could AI's role in public opinion analytics lead to more fragmented or cohesive political landscape?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you so much, Shivam. I think a hammer is only as good as what you do with it. It's been trained on all the stereotypical text from the web, so it's really good at picking up stereotypes and actually driving people apart. So in emphasizing the stereotypes of each one of us. So currently, the way it's being used or the way it's being evaluated suggests that it is actually dividing deeper polarization than helping people come together. But I did provide a couple of hopeful examples which can hopefully take it in a different direction. Thanks for the question.
Yeah, thank you so much, ma'am. Dr. Chris, if I may ask, and since you talked about on the accuracy of polling data highlights trend where poll vote errors tend to decline as an election approaches. This phenomenon seems to reflect the increasing informativeness of the polls over time. In today's landscape where AI can rapidly process and analyze vast amount of real-time data, how do you foresee AI influencing this pattern? And specifically, do you think AI could accelerate the reduction of poll vote errors by refining data collections and analysis in the final stages of campaign, or might introduce a new complexities that affect this trajectory?
Thanks, Shivam. By the way, interesting presentations, everybody. Thank you so much. There's two parts to that question, I think. I don't know. I don't know. It seems like I think you want me to focus on both. One is a polls part, but also one is a preference part.
Yeah.
Right. I think. I mean, one of the interesting things that I didn't really get into in the presentation, but I've done it in other work, and it's in the slide deck, the extra slides. I don't know if you took a look at that, Shivam, but the poll errors have actually, despite what the attention paid to big errors, poll errors have actually been flat over history, right, or declined actually. So if you had to pick, have they gone up or have they gone down? If you're forced to pick, they've probably gone down. And but that partly reflects, right, the news coverage and the like, right? We tend to focus on, when crime happens, not when it doesn't, right? When money buys votes, when it doesn't, not when it doesn't. And the same thing is true with polls. So that's important backdrop here. So now, why is that? Is that, the argument is that polling technology is, response rates have gone down, right? Who are these people? I mean, we don't take polls. So who are these people? So does AI offer? So apparently polling organizations have been doing things to sort of compensate for that, right? Or response rates don't matter. It's probably a combination, right? Their effects are smaller than people think, but they also have other ways around that. The question is, how would AI help or hurt that, right? And it's not clear to me how. It's a little like forecasting elections. So AI to me is in that space, right? More like, okay, so what's going to lead preferences to do what they do over time, which we don't address in this research, right? But it do address in other research. So that's really, I think, where AI comes in. So can AI foreshadow, right? Can it develop a better model of the election outcome than political scientists can do, right, without it? And I think that's kind of where the question is about. And I know that's a long-winded answer, but I wanted to sort of lay out the terrain. Does that make sense to you, Shivam?
Yeah. Perfect. So that makes very much sense.
Thanks.
All right. Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Chris. So, Dr. Sain, if I may ask, since you presented your work on AI's influence on media market, your presentation shed light on how digital technologies disrupt media markets. So, considering this, how do you anticipate AI will affect the structure and the power dynamics within these markets? And AI algorithms are often designed to maximize usage engagement, But could this focus lead to greater polarization or spread of misinformation, especially in the political arena, since you talked about on social media and all? And how responsible do you think AI algorithms are for these issues?
Thanks, Shivam. Yeah, so I think I think, AI, generative AI is definitely here to stay. What exact role it'll play also depends on, the direction that we let it take, right? And I mean, I think it's sort of also in line with the stuff that Kokals spoke about, right? I think based on my research, I can see that there are harms of potential harms coming from AI when it comes to the low cost of generation of misinformation. Um, and this can potentially, proliferate quite a bit. uh, but the flip side of using these automated models could also be that you can fact check at scale, or so you can leverage the same technology, but then it becomes a bit of a cat and mouse game. And so pros and cons, it's when it comes to the media industry, the use of these technologies by journalists, I think, as a writing tool, it can be very useful, though I don't know what exactly the productivity benefits would be going forward. um but yeah, overall, I am slightly concerned uh at basically providing, you know even though it has upsides, providing a tool in the hands of people to generate uh misinformation much more easily than before. I think, again, related to Kokil's sort of work, I was one thing that I'm sort of unsure of is, whether AI generated messages are more persuasive than human generated messages, right? Misinformation or otherwise. I think there is some work coming out in this area, but I think that, testing this, in survey experiments that Kokil mentioned, that I've done myself, but also, actually carrying these out in the field is super important, just to see, how these things might play out in the quote unquote real world. So, big picture sort of answer.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Sain, for your insights. Dr. Connor, like your research explores how machine learning is applied into the political science, and as an AI models become more advanced in predicting voter behaviors, do you think that there is a risk that we might shift towards a form of predictive democracy where algorithms rather than public debates shapes electoral outcomes? And what are the ethical and philosophical challenges we could face with this potential shift? And how should we address them if such things happens?
No, those are definitely big questions. So I think we'll see what we can do to try to give, just a few thoughts about that. So yeah, it's a good question. I mean, one question is just is there an intrinsic level of unpredictability in how preferences and other things unfold? So Chris, I think, there's some degree of pull and error. One question would be even if we had in a sense, the right model for how preferences evolve over time, there might still be some error term associated with that. So no matter how advanced the machine learning model got, there might still be some intrinsic unpredictability. And there's interesting work on why that might be the case. So, you know, being unpredictable makes it harder to be exploited, for example, from a kind of game theoretic evolutionary perspective. So I think that probably is going to be there to some extent. But at the same time, I think my big question is just what happens when the AI tools of today become the agents of tomorrow. So right now, it's mostly, it's individuals, it's people who are using the tool to perform some task. So, I want to write a blog post about the election. So I I give the LLM some seed words and it spits out an article for me that I then post somewhere, or I want it to generate an image. So, it's humans who are doing that. But the next generation of AI research is much more focused on making the AI tools agentic, giving them the ability to basically make websites, open up a LinkedIn account, and so on and so forth. So my big worry is less about predicting human behavior, but more about just the ability to distinguish what's real and what's not real in an even deeper sense than today, with the increasingly agentic role that these things probably will play. So I think there's some interesting schemes just to try to increase the ability to verify what's human, what's not human. I know, those CAPTCHAs that we're all familiar with, trying to log into websites, that's an early start to that. But I think there will be much more, in that direction going forward as it gets harder and harder to find tasks that humans can do that AI systems can't do. So does this mean biometrics? Does this mean other things? I think all those have been discussed in policy forums. So maybe the answer is yes. So those are some thoughts. I also think that AI tools have some, and I think some of the presentations mentioned this, some promise in terms of education, teaching. If every student has basically a personalized tutor to help them think through problems, think through the processing of information, could this be positive? Could this be positive? That would be one question. And then the other thought would be just summarizing large amounts of information. That's very hard for humans to do. It's very time consuming. But could LLMs basically take a 30-page policy agenda item from, let's say, party A and then compare it to party B and help voters in that sense as well. So I think definitely it's a tool like any other. So there will be positive uses, there will be negative uses. There will be probably continuing degree of intrinsic uncertainty around how society evolves. So those are just a few thoughts. You asked really big questions, and those are just a few initial starts. And I'd be very curious to hear what others have to say as well.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Conrad. If I may ask to Professor Kokil about the ethics in the AI and digital moderation. So, with your expertise and in AI-driven content moderation and its impact on online political discourse, how do you view the ethical boundaries of such technologies? And is there a risk that AI could inadvertently enforce a form of digital censorship, especially in underrepresented region and languages? Or what safeguards should be put in place to ensure that AI moderation protects rather than undermines the integrity of democratic debate?
Shivam, that's 3 questions.
Yeah,
but
you'll get a proper time. Yeah.
okay, no,
Yeah.
thanks for the questions. Of course, they're very important questions. I want to first point out that humans are terrible at content moderation as well. So in my prior work, we've looked at what we're doing for what already exists for shadow, like for censorship and for so-called improving the content on social media platforms. And we're already doing a terrible job of censoring the most important issues in favor of things that could drive more ad revenue or more engagement. So humans are terrible at it already, and we're using algorithms to to reinforce our decisions and to reinforce the way people behave on social media platforms. If this gets more AI generated, it will, like I said, probably exacerbate these biases. Is it going to be better or worse? Given that now there is more talk about creating and including ethical frameworks, there have been some positive changes. For instance, for all its problems, X has released, or at least at one point it had released its algorithms for the social feed, and community notes fact checking data is open to the public. So those kinds of changes are positive. They take the hood off of the inner workings. I do feel like we are still far away from a point where we can be truly equitable in the online space. Would it inadvertently push digital censorship? Yeah, it's absolutely doing so already. And because the people who drive and create these technologies are people from certain backgrounds and from certain political standings, and they're shameless about including those ideas in their technology, as many anecdotal examples that we've all come across in our time on the web. In terms of safeguards, again, this becomes an issue of either academics talking to other academics, or news media just blowing up the hype. In terms of systemic change, there still remains a lot to be done. On our part, I think what's increasingly happening is that there are not even safeguards for how educators or researchers are using generative AI. So while society there's still problems with society and how it's running. I think the least we can do at our end is ensure that the academic communities we are a part of have some standards in place for how AI should be used. Thanks for the question.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Kokil. And if I may ask to Dr. Sain, just to follow up with this flavor, what Dr. Kokil has said, that given the increasing use of like AI for curating and moderating content, as Dr. Kokil has talked about on these platforms, on social media platforms, how do you think this technology might impact the democratic deliberation, if I may say so? And specifically, could AI-driven algorithms unintentionally can create an echo chambers where people only see viewpoints similar to their own? And if so, how might this challenge the diverse and the open discussion that is fundamental to democratic society?
Yeah, again, I think those are, sort of big questions, and I think, absolutely pertinent ones. One, like before coming to your question, like one of your previous question, and something that also Kokul mentioned, is
Hmm.
that I think that uh, we should yeah, this is a view that I've sort of evolved towards, is that we shouldn't sort of demonize news outlets to that try to get reader engagement and add revenue. Of course, it can anything can be taken to an extreme, but at the end of the day, news outlets, if they're financially healthy, can actually produce better content, investigative content. And historically, they've utilized advertising revenue to actually break away from political parties and have an independent point of view. And whether it's ad revenue driven or subscription driven, you know each of these different types of business models can inject their own sort of biases. So it's just to sort of put that out there. But it's like super relevant sort of discussions. When it comes to social media in particular, I think the use of bots and the use of bots and the automated generation of this sort of content interacting with the personalization algorithms on social media. I mean, these are like lots of forces coming together, which can definitely impact the type of content that you see, and more see more like-minded content, which can potentially lead you to an echo chamber. So I think that is a real concern. Some of the more recent evidence just on the algorithm front seems to suggest that social media algorithms, the personalization algorithms don't matter as much relative to just people seeking that content out, right? But with these bots, with this automated generation of biased content, misinformation, it's potentially easier for people to find it and find the content that they're looking for, which might be potentially harmful. And I think that going forward, I think that that is definitely a problem. And I think we really need to, there was a bunch of papers that came out where academics partnered up with Meta, and they manipulated social media feeds and algorithms and stuff like that, and they didn't find too much of an effect of these algorithms. And the caveats are that that was in partial equilibrium. It's come at a time where people are already used to this content. You remove content for a month or two, so it comes with those caveats. But going forward, I think we just need more of this, more longer term studies, more of such collaborations or the opportunity for academics to carry out their own audits, which is getting harder and harder. Yeah, but I think it's an, even though current evidence is sort of mixed, I'm still concerned about these different automation technologies, sort of driving a wedge and leading us to, into these sort of echo chambers.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Sain. Dr. Chris, you talked about party size, system characteristics, and your work has underscored the importance of party size and system characteristics in determining polling accuracy. So my question is still give this some sorts of flavors of AI's predictive capabilities. And as AI becomes increasingly powerful enough in its ability to analyze electoral data, do you believe that it can effectively model and predict these nuanced factors, such as the impact of party size on voter behaviors? And what challenges might AI face in accurately accounting for these variables? And could there be a risk of oversimplification?
Sure. I mean, yeah, good question. I mean, what will we be doing with this technology in the future? I'm not 100% sure, right? I mean, is anybody? Sure. Could it help? Sure. I mean, I think one of the ways I think it's going to matter to this kind of if you recall my answer to your first question was mostly about polling and sort of prediction forecasting. But the other part of the equation is preference evolution, which really has a lot to do more with, I think, the rest of the panelists talked about, right? There's a lot underneath the hood of this broad architecture I outlined. The architecture, nevertheless, is really, really important because it constrains a lot of what can happen, right? But it also can reflect what is happening. And so to the extent AI allows campaigns to more effectively target, right, tap into people's sort of latent preferences earlier than later, right, to ignite their overarching sort of preferences for a candidate, for a party earlier, then we should have effects on the pattern of convergence, right? Because it's not so much about poll accuracy unto itself, but as a reflection of the degree to which preferences have come into focus over time, right? And so to the extent AI can affect that, then it will have an impact on the kinds of analyses I do, right? Does that get it?
I want to
Okay.
point out that thanks, Professor Chris, for sharing. And I want to point out that for anything and everything that we do with social media, we always need to benchmark it against real people. And that's why the polls are always the winner in terms of actually having a real metric of public attitudes. So the resource you shared is going to be super helpful as well for an ongoing project I'm working on. Thank you.
Yeah. So, yeah, Dr. Connor, I would like to hear your thoughts about, like, since you work in economics and political science, machine learning, could the predictive capabilities of AI lead to like new economic models such as the voter preferences, the voter predictiveness for the understanding the electoral dynamics? Or there are any limitations or challenges in applying AI to political strategy that we need to consider? You talked about the strategies related to elections and all.
Yeah, good question. So my sense is that parties, have a certain reputation, have a certain history associated with them, and there might be a cost to, in a sense, deviating from that history. So I think there's, I think Chris, you know this far better than I do, but my sense is that there's work on how voters can punish parties for inconsistent behavior. So the optimization problem can become quite intricate in the sense that the best thing for me to do in this current election might lead to downstream consequences that might be negative. So choosing policy A might be good for this election, but then maybe that has a cost. If I, in the past, always supported policy B, there could be an electoral punishment factor associated with that. That might be hard to predict. So I think generally that history aspect makes this sort of complete, optimization of policies difficult. But at the same time, but at the same time, there are new forms of markets, or there are new forms of kind of information around politics that might not be entirely connected with AI, or in a more indirect way. So I'm thinking of like the electoral betting markets, which has become increasingly popular here in the US. And there's all this algorithmic betting that happens in the financial markets, and I'm sure within these kind of markets for markets over elections as well. So there's a sense in which AI systems, algorithmic trading systems, could influence kind of the efficiency of those betting markets, and that could have downstream consequences for how predictive they are about outcomes. So in other words, I think there are questions about how good are our predictions about outcomes, which is one set of questions. Then another set of questions would be how good are policies and politicians about predicting optimal behavior in this sort of dynamic time series sense. So those are just a few thoughts, and I'd be curious, Chris, and I know others too, just thoughts about the performance of betting markets relative to polls in this sort of setup that you introduced earlier. So that would just be one question that I have for Chris, but thank you for the question.
And I was just checking the Q&A. I think all of you have already answered the Q&A section, so I think we don't need to get it into that. So on behalf of the Center for Software and Information Technology Management, CSITM at IIM Bangalore, I would like to extend our sincere gratitude to our panelists, Dr. Christopher Velezi and Dr. Ananya Sen, Dr. Connor T. Jozak, and Dr. Kokil Chetka, for their valuable contribution to our discussion. Your insights into the evolving role of AI and data analytics in electoral processes have been truly enlightening for all of us as we navigate the implications of these technologies in both current and upcoming elections. Your expertise has provided us with a deeper understanding of their transformative potential and associated challenges. We appreciate your time and efforts in sharing your knowledge and perspectives. Thank you all the attendees for your participation and engagement. Please do visit whenever you are in India or near to Bangalore at our IIM Bangalore campus. It's a very clean and plush campus located in Bangalore, and we look forward to future discussions and continued exploration of these critical topics. Thank you once again, and bye.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Oh,
Yeah,
thank you.
yeah, thanks.
It was great.
Yeah, good.
Did you like it?
Yeah.
How'd you like it?
Yeah, I liked it. Okay.
Good. Let's keep in touch. I'd like to see what you're doing, and
Yeah.
good questions. Good program. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Chris. Bye.